I do think that it's the question as to the ultimate motivation and then what the end goal is. I think that we do want to, Congress is trying to make sure that we're not supporting what appear to be violations of human rights, but also this is making it more costly for companies to import from China. So they're spending the money on the compliance infrastructure, but essentially it's just a big disincentive for sourcing products from China.
From China,
yeah.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Hidden Traffic. This is Gwen Hassan, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Virginia Newman. Virginia is counsel in the International Department, Miller Chevalier. So I'm so excited to have you here, Virginia.
Thank you so much for having me, Gwen. I'm very excited to be here, excited to be on your podcast. I've loved listening to it so far. Heard great things about you from Richard Mojica, so very excited for this.
Well, Richard is the one who recommended I talk to you. So we're all, forming a fan club for each other. It's excellent. He, as the listeners may remember, was on a couple of months ago talking about the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act in advance of any guidance that we had received, kind of giving us a preview about what we thought might be coming. And then once guidance was released from CBP, I had another colleague of mine who talked about kind of the CBP guidance. And I'm hopeful that you and I can talk a little bit about DHS and their guidance, as well as now that it's been out for 5-ish weeks, what we're seeing in terms of enforcement and where things are looking. But before we get there, I'm getting ahead of myself. Tell us a little bit about you, about your background. How did you come to be interested in human trafficking prevention? Was it through trade work, or how did you get here?
Yeah. So as you said, I'm in Miller and Chevalier's International Department based out of DC, but my background is really in China. And so my initial interest in, even before the law and particularly in compliance, was just initially in Chinese language, history, and literature. So that was what I studied in college. I got to spend some time there in college and then after college on U.S. and Chinese government scholarship looking at local public policy in Jiangxi province in China for anyone who's familiar.
Convenient, right there. Yeah.
Yeah. Xinjiang, and never been to Xinjiang, but Jiangxi and Nanchang is a wonderful, wonderful city and province, and I really loved living there. And then I went to law school, and I knew I was interested in litigation and investigations more so than in our just general corporate work. Yeah. So I started out in the New York office of Gibson Dunn and pretty quickly started working with the China team under an absolutely amazing attorney and partner there who runs their Asia-based teams, and ended up going over to Hong Kong to do a rotation with them in 2016. And then I moved back to Hong Kong full-time in 2018. And while I was there, so I was primarily working in investigations on anti-corruption, fraud, and money laundering. And then while I was there, I ended up doing a significant amount of pro bono work in the human trafficking space.
Okay.
So working closely with some experts over there in the nonprofit sector. And then I had 3 clients, 3 women that developed really close relationships with and just got to learn so much about their background and their experience. And there's obviously issues in industries over there as well with forced labor. So that just kind of became an inlet to learning about the issues of the tech supply chain and the apparel supply chain. And then came back over to the US during COVID at the end of 2020 and started pretty quickly working with Richard in the business and human rights practice, and also with Nate Langford.
Oh, sure.
And yeah, who's fantastic. And they're both just so wonderful to work with. And this is an issue that's just very hot right now. And so I started working on the forced labor issues and in compliance more generally on the human rights side. And that's just been so rewarding and satisfying. I've loved it. There's an infinite amount to learn in this sector right now in the space. We have great clients too. So
what a great story. I love that arc of it started in a place like me, actually, that was not at all based in law. I had no intent of going to law school, zero. And life's turns and twists ended up leading me there, kind of like it did with you. And how neat that you're able now to combine kind of your love of the language and culture with the practice of law, too. I love that. Great.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that that's what keeps it interesting, learning about other cultures.
Me too. We are very similar in that regard. I spent some time in China as well, doing investigations for prior companies. And I'll tell you a very quick, funny story, entirely unrelated to trafficking, just because it relates to China. I was seeing the Great Wall, and I was very excited about it. And I had finished hiking the wall, and it was the section that was in Beijing, and you have to walk kind of through this. It's not really a staircase, but a slant that goes down back to the base. And along both sides, there are vendors that are selling, I hiked the wall t-shirts and, magnets and all kinds of stuff. And this Chinese woman very excitedly came over and said, I have t-shirts in big sizes for American lady.
Oh, lovely. Lovely.
And I thought, wow, she has just called me and my entire country fat. That's great.
They don't beat around the bush about their opinions. That is for sure. When I lived there, it was so funny. Like if I dropped a couple pounds or gained a couple pounds, my friends would immediately come up and be like, you gained weight. Oh, you lost weight. Yeah, when you go to the U.S., don't leave with your conversations with that, because women there don't love it. Men, I don't think do either.
Well, it's fair too, because I was going to, compared to most Chinese women or people in general, I am huge. So there.
You are not. I think it is even offensive to some younger Chinese women too.
Oh, really?
So.
All right. Well, I digress. In any case, I've spent some time in China, but I've never been to Xinjiang either. So I'm still learning more about, and I had no idea when I was there that there was this connection to human trafficking at all. So it's something I've learned about over the course of the last 10-ish years as well. So when the guidance came out related to the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which I refuse to refer to as UFLPA.
I'm in the same boat. I refuse as well.
Don't like that very much. And I read through the guidance and thought, okay, this sounds very customs-y. It's very similar to the kind of guidance they've given importers before. It seems consistent with, although maybe a little amped up version of their withhold release order process. So it wasn't anything kind of groundbreaking. However, I will say I feel a little differently about the guidance that's now come out from DHS. And it's not really fair to say it's coming from DHS because it's coming from the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, which there is no acronym that I can pronounce for. So we're just going to call it the task force, but that's led by DHS or chaired by them. And as I read through the guidance, which, by the way, listeners, is available on the DHS website, dhs.gov. If you search for the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, or you look at forced labor or anything, it'll bring up this guidance for you. But it is a 60-page PDF full of what they refer to as the strategy. And the strategy starts out with where you would think everybody should start, with a risk assessment. Is that, and I know I'm kind of which came first, chicken or the egg-ing here, but there's questions that I get all the time from people about whether you should map your supply chain and then do a risk assessment, or whether you should do a risk assessment and then map your supply chain, as if they're separate things. And I'm wondering if they're actually part and parcel of each other. What do you think about that?
I think that we have kind of tailored advice that we give to different companies based on what their imports look like, or kind of their general cross-section. I think that the risk assessment is that the supply chain is a part of the risk assessment and due diligence. So ideally, if you import just a few products or you make just a few products, ideally you can just map the supply chain for those products. Perfect scenario is you have one product that you import and maybe it's like 2 or 3 different supply lines and you can just map those straight out. There are a lot of companies though that, apparel is one sector that's a perfect example that maybe they've got hundreds of styles. And so they might source from hundreds of different ultimate suppliers in that full supply chain. Yeah. And then there's also big box stores. We're getting increasingly more requests from companies that maybe have a whole slate of different products and they don't even know, what proportion of those might be in what they would call like a high risk category. So for those companies, maybe a long-term goal is to do supply chain mapping for every single product using some sort of automated software, which I know there are some of those providers now. But realistically, if we're thinking about risk assessment means what is the highest risk category for us? So first step of a risk assessment in that case is really, and I know that your previous host mentioned this too, but speaking to the product teams and figuring out which of these products might have high risk inputs in them, which of these should we focus on mapping first? So like I'm actually working on a risk assessment project for a company right now, and we're actually mapping one input first because that's going to inform the next steps for the risk assessment. And you have to kind of be dynamic like that and think about your particular product, your customers, whether you're directly importing before just sort of automatically just right out the gate thinking, okay, I'm going to map the supply chain for every single product, because that might put you on your back foot if a detention comes. We're in a time crunch. You don't necessarily have the time to do all of that right away.
A colleague, I won't identify her company, but she works for a large distributor and she's in compliance, and they import, I'm trying to remember how many line items she told me it was, but they have, a catalog of products that they distribute that's well into the tens of thousands. And so she was trying to figure out, where do I even start? I don't even know, because I can't map the supply chain for 25,000 products. Like I don't have the time to do that. And even if I could, I don't know where the value is right now, because, a lot of the supply chains have nothing to do with China, and some of them overlap, and some of them, and she was ripping her hair out trying to figure out where to start. So I like that advice that you see, talking about kind of looking at inputs. And maybe that's a good way to break down that 25,000, line item list to a much smaller group to start with. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we've created some risk matrices that we've used both pre and post UFLPA that can be tailored company by company, but very generally we'll look at, does the product contain a high risk input like cotton or silica-based material, polysilicon or tomato? Is it in a high risk sector? So even if it contains a silica-based product, it might not be a sector that CBP is enforcing just yet. Is the import directly from China, or is the final manufacturer located in China? And then kind of finally, this is more of a business consideration. Is this a really high value import to you? Is it critical to later stage manufacturing in the States? Can you not produce if you don't get it? Or is it the bulk of your sales are based on this product? In that case, even if it doesn't have a high risk input, we would suggest you should include it in the mapping, because it sounds like it's bet the business on that product.
I really like that idea of the matrix, because so often, especially when you're talking to sourcing people, in my experience, they get very focused on particular either HTS codes, or they're looking at tariff rates, and they're not taking into account kind of those other matrices, right? Which is, how much of this are we doing, and how important is this to the rest of our business? I won't identify which company, but a company that I have done some work for, who came back very, very concerned about a particular soy product and wanting to know if it was going to be, kind of annexed on with the tomatoes, given that it was an agricultural good and they were importing it from China, but they were importing tiny amounts of it because most of the soy they were getting was from here in the US. So I went back to them with very similar advice, which was, I'm happy to look at this for you, but I wouldn't prioritize this, given that it's a tiny portion of your overall, risk profile right now. Let's focus on where the bigger bang is in terms of risk and work our way back from there. So, all right. What struck you most about the DHS guidance? I will say for me, it was the specific call out to look at technology and the fact that technology and technological solutions should be used as part of your strategy, which is the first time I've seen that in kind of a guidance document from the government, except I think maybe of the DOJ guidance about data. They're big on data. But this specific DHS guidance was really talking about and emphasizing the use of technology. What did you think of that? And what else stuck out to you in this?
Richard also picked up on that, the nod to technology. I noticed it in the enforcement strategy, but it wasn't something that I particularly honed in on. And I think that the difference there is that I'm typically doing the nuts and bolts of deploying all of this. And so in my mind, I'm like, technology, great idea. We do partner with where we have worked in the course of representing clients. We've worked with some of the technology providers that can help to automate the diligence process. And particularly, I think what a lot of companies are excited about is the potential for some DNA and forensic testing
Yeah.
source to figure out the origin of the raw materials, which would be huge
It
for
would
the
be
cotton sector.
fantastic. Yeah.
Huge,
Yeah.
huge. But as far as I'm concerned, I saw that line, and the thing that stuck out to me was must be verifiable, and whatever cautionary language they used about how you need to demonstrate the reliability of the
Of the
technology.
tech. Yeah.
And in my mind, I thought I cannot counsel a company that they should rely on that and think that they're covered. Because as far as I'm concerned, I've never seen CBP react to that information and say, you're good without anything else.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as far as I'm concerned, it's like, okay, great. We can include that as one component of our submission, or as one, maybe if you're in a lower risk sector or you're not a direct importer and you just need to provide information to your downstream customers. If there's not a direct enforcement risk, I could see maybe hinging your diligence around that. But for most other companies, I think it'll continue to just be an ancillary add-on until we get more clear guidance from CBP that they,
kind of a nice to have in the future thing, but not necessarily a core solution at the moment thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned enforcement. Let's pivot to that. Have we seen any yet? And what is it looking like?
So there have been some early enforcement. I have seen some inklings of potential detentions in new sectors, but that's just through secondhand. I've seen it online and I've been trying to dig down and find the original source, not able to confirm it. My understanding right now is that the detentions are mostly focused on sectors that have already experienced detentions, and CBP is already familiar with their supply lines. They've been detaining them under the WROs, and now they're detaining them under the UFLPA. So these are companies that are very sophisticated in their due diligence. They're sophisticated in putting together submissions to CBP, and they understand generally what the process entails. So it's been interesting because it shows a window into how the enforcement is different than under the WRO framework, which I personally wasn't expecting. I thought that the big takeaway from the UFLPA was broader reach for the import ban rather than deeper reach in existing industries as well.
I had the same assumption. I was assuming that it was a way of increasing the base, if you will, of what CBP was looking at. So kind of a, hey, we've dabbled in this before, but now we're coming out and we're going to make this kind of a sweeping presumptive rejection scenario, and that we would see this in all different kinds of industries. And we haven't.
I've heard some other folks in this space talking about what will be required under the UFLPA. And you also asked, what kind of stands out in the enforcement strategy. One thing that I've learned in recent weeks is that CBP is really focused on the raw material. So even when we think of sectors maybe that are higher risk in the intermediary stages of production, according to NGO reports or even other government guidance, it sounds like CBP views the enforcement strategy as mandating that companies go all the way back to the raw material, no matter what.
Yeah.
So if your goods are detained, they're going to expect that full supply chain tracing information, which is different than some of the enforcement we saw before that.
And I think in many ways that is, at least to some of the in-house practitioners that I talk to, their worst fear, because a lot of them have strategies in place where they feel pretty good about going back to the manufacturer space, right? Because they've got good documentation of who shipped it and where it came from and where it was manufactured. It's the earlier stages, the back to the mine or the field or the tree, that really is concerning, because that becomes so difficult, especially to do from afar. And especially given that now in China, there are the rules that are saying, kind of in an anti-boycott place, you can't participate in audits that relate to Uyghur labor or to Xinjiang. So how have you been counseling clients to get at that information? Do you use an outside auditing firm? And how do you know that they're reliable? Do you kind of cloak your inquiries in very non-specific language that never says Xinjiang and never says Uyghur? Or is it a combination of the above? How do people get at that kind of all the way back to the source information?
Yeah. I have a couple observations on that. The first is that I think the enforcement strategy actually helped in some respects in that they set out these two paths, both the importer guides and the enforcement strategy. a scope review, which says, no, our stuff is not from the XUAR. You therefore don't need to apply this rebuttable presumption and you can admit our goods into the States. Or you're trying to overcome the rebuttable presumption, which is this incredible mountain to try to climb. We've had some companies maybe considering it, but the general view is that this is just probably not going to be possible, especially when you look at what the enforcement strategy requires you to have in place in order to be able to overcome that rebuttable presumption. So in that way, I think it actually helps a little bit because if your goods are coming from the XUAR, you're not really faced with, do I reach out to suppliers or not? You're kind of faced with, do I stop sourcing
do I
from
do
there?
this business or not?
Yeah. That is swallowing such a high level of risk that I think you're essentially assuming that you probably aren't going to come under the scope of enforcement or your customers won't. That's kind of my view on that. But when it comes to reaching out to customers, I think a lot of companies believe that sending these kind of certifications to their suppliers and asking them to certify is giving them some sort of insurance cover. I think that maybe it gives some internal comfort and it shows like a step that's been taken, that you've tried to do some supplier outreach. I know that there is a nod to including some of this information in your contracts and the supplier code of conduct, but I think it's a little bit of a fig leaf. I don't think it actually really gives you anything. I've done a lot of these submissions to CBP, and those certifications, other than, you need a certificate of origin to be able to do your actual submission, but that's never a critical centerpiece of our submission. That diligence isn't deep enough. It's just asking somebody to sign a piece of paper. And we've seen customs ask questions about that and say, well, where's the supporting documentation to prove that what they said is correct? So one thing that both combining the anti-foreign sanctions law in China with the UFLPA, one thing that's shifted even in the time that I've been working in this space is the kind of supplier outreach component. I think there used to be a preference for working directly with suppliers, maybe sending in auditing teams. And now there's a recognition that one, CBP doesn't necessarily think that that's going to be a reliable source in certain areas in particular, but increasingly questioning the industry over there in general. And then two, it poses significant risk to potentially the company if the supplier has concerns and reports that information to authorities in China. And then it also could pose risk to individuals that are on the ground too. We haven't really heard of actual risks. That is 100% what we counsel clients early and often is that we need to come up with a plan on this that will usually involve us speaking with local counsel and multiple functions in China. And you might want to be careful about how you package it to them too, because you don't want those individuals to be put in a position where they're
of violating their local law for working
100%. But you want to loop them in as well, because you don't want to not involve them in the process if it could pose some risks to them. So that's the trickiest situation. And I think there's increasingly a preference for trying to get information without needing to rely heavily on supplier outreach.
I think about this from a philosophical standpoint, and I'm not asking you to solve this, but I wonder, and I'm musing aloud, if this will turn out to be, and I've mentioned previously, like conflict minerals, where, we came out with all of these strict reporting requirements in Sarbanes-Oxley about tracing back to the bag and tag solutions and use of blockchain to track the origin of certain minerals coming out of the Central Democratic Republic of Congo. And now years later, what we found is that people pulled out of that region entirely and left those people who were working in the mines, those children who were being trafficked in the mines, without other sources of income. So they have now become allegedly one of the larger exporters of heroin in the world because they've switched and pivoted to now figure out another industry that they can make money off of in that same region. Also, there's a bunch of undercover work that shows that you can buy the barcodes that are a clean link to a clean mine on the black market. You can buy
unbelievable
of them. Yeah. So it really makes you question, is the act itself in the conflict minerals case turned into kind of a perverse incentive for people to work their way around it, and it's not really solving anything. So I hate to think that the same thing is true here, but it does bring up the question, right? If everyone flees suddenly from the Xinjiang region and doesn't do business in the region at all, so that they can use that exclusion argument, right? Our goods aren't subject because they're not coming from here. Then does that drive the movement or further trafficking of people to different regions? Does it give an incentive for manufacturers to move their locations so they're in, a neighboring region and they're trafficking people there instead? What are we creating by putting in place this law, I wonder? I know that's a little pessimistic.
No, I don't know that Congress necessarily thought out the wider ranging implications of the law. And this is always something that even folks on the U.S. side of the aisle and then on the Chinese side, everybody has certain views as to the underlying reasons for the law, because it seems like a bit of a bludgeon and it might harm folks or cause impacts. If we're looking at this just pure human rights impact assessment, we don't really know ultimately what the result will be. And you don't want companies conducting audits of their China-based suppliers and seeing that there's a Uyghur on the list or someone from Xinjiang and saying, oh no, this is now a really risky supplier, and saying we don't want to work with them because they have Uyghurs employed at the factory. Like, that's not the end result goal. But I do think that a lot of companies, at least the ones that we work with and have been working with for a while, particularly in the apparel space, it's actually across the board. They are really ethical companies that are absolutely trying to do the right thing. And I think that they are more nuanced in their approach than CBP is. So what's great about having these cross-functional teams at the table is you're not just having these legal heads come in and say, here's what we need to do to strictly comply with the law. You're also having your responsible sourcing team there, your CSR team, maybe your investor relations team. And they're thinking about, most companies have principles that are involve respecting human rights, living up to their commitments to the UN GPs. And when they look at
values-based team,
100%, when they look at the results of the risk assessment, which maybe was driven from a legal compliance perspective, they think, okay, how can we make sure that we're not harming the stakeholders on the ground? When you see that, it's really inspirational. It kind of makes you think, hey, even though I don't know what it means for the XUAR region, I assume that China will continue to invest in that region and make sure that it doesn't hurt them too much. I know that they're saying that it hasn't hurt the industry there, but there's conflicting reports. But as far as what American companies can do, they are trying to be a little bit more nuanced in how they go about enforcing the law.
A little more holistic of a view, as opposed to just a black and white, oh, nope, we're cutting off business here.
That's the easy way to do it, right?
Right. I mean, stop doing business in China entirely. Okay, great. Is not feasible and also not the responsible choice.
I don't think so. I mean, I personally would just be heartbroken if we continue to sever the relationships between the two countries. I think this is, the business relationship is what keeps us all in a kind of safe place geopolitically. And I love working with the teams in China. And that's also a kind of tricky conversation when you go into a meeting with the company's team in China and you're basically coming over as a U.S. lawyer via Zoom saying, here's what we need to do to make sure that there's no human rights abuses in your supply chain over there. And I try to be very intentional about those conversations and very open and non-judgmental, because there's very different views on this topic. And we need the participation of everyone to keep the company safe and to live up to their commitments to respect human rights.
That is such a good point. I was reminded of something like that the other day because I'm on a little bit of a political tangent here, but after the overturn of Roe v. Wade, you saw, I think it was France, England, other countries making statements saying that they were concerned about the human rights implications for the United States. And the reaction of some people that I spoke to about that was to be very offended. Like, how dare those Europeans tell us how we should run our company? And I thought, how ironic is that? Because as Americans, we do that all the time. We tell other people, whether it's the Central Democratic Republic of Congo or whether it's China, that we think that their human right violations are terrible, and yet our own house at home isn't as clean as it should be or could be. So it's a little bit of throwing rocks from a glass house, but
absolutely.
Again, I digress.
I do think that it's the question as to the ultimate motivation and then what the end goal is. I think that we do want to, Congress is trying to make sure that we're not supporting what appear to be violations of human rights. But also, this is making it more costly for companies to import from China. So they're spending the money on the compliance infrastructure, but essentially it's just a big disincentive for sourcing products from China.
From China.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, Virginia. I love talking to you.
Could have gone for 2 more hours. Let's just do this all day.
Just chat all day. Well, thank you for the information. How can people reach out to you if they want to learn more about your practice or about the kind of risk matrix that you were talking about earlier? Where's the best place to get in touch with you?
I'm on Miller and Chevalier's website. I'm on LinkedIn, Virginia Newman. My email is bnewman@millchev.com. If you're interested in just talking about this from an intellectual perspective, I love doing that, obviously, and also able to answer any questions anybody has. I will definitely stay in this space, so we'll be watching along with everyone else to see what happens.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Gwen.